What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name is Erica, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, I am chatting to Dr. Jerry Toner. Dr. Toner is the Director of Classic Studies at Churchill College, Cambridge, and is most well known for his various publications on the ancient Roman world. However, today we are here to discuss his book titled Infamy, The Crimes of Ancient Rome. Now, as you guys can see from my notes, I have read, demolished, and thoroughly enjoyed this book. And today I really wanted to bring you guys a discussion of what it was like with the legal system of ancient Rome, the crimes that would be involved, etc., etc. Thought it would be something nice and different and fun for you guys to engage with. It goes without saying you guys can find links to Infamy in the description below. If at any point you guys get excited by the topic, you guys want to know more, have no fear. I have made it as easy as possible to check this book out. But before we can get into what it was like in ancient Rome, how dangerous it was, what crimes we can expect to uncover throughout this book, we always start with the classicist sitting in front of me. So today, Dr. Toner, can you start the ball rolling with this conversation by telling us about your classics background? When did you first discover classics? How did you come to it? And how did it lead you to now being at Cambridge?
So I actually come from a pretty modest background. I went to a fairly rubbish state school, but I got a scholarship to a very posh private school when I was 11. And they had a wonderful classics department full of teachers who had PhDs from Oxbridge, and they were a very inspiring bunch, and they really got me into the subject. I think it's always why I've had an angle, if you like, on the subject of trying to look at it from below, trying to look at the rough side of life, the ordinary Romans, the slaves, all the people who we don't really hear about much in the sources.
And just so that you guys know, today we're here to talk about Infamy, the crimes of ancient Rome. But there are some great conversations that Dr. Toner has done about his other book, which is you have many other books, but the most, I would say, talked about one, at least on the internet side of things, is How to Manage Your Slaves. So you guys can also find that linked in the description below, as well as a great interview that you did with Garrett Stone about that book. But we're here to talk about laws, crimes, all of that fun stuff today. So I thought we could start off with a really general question, though, just to kind of get everybody up to speed. How dangerous was ancient Rome?
Actually, that's a very difficult question. You think it would be easy to answer that, but of course, it depends a bit who you were. I mean, if you were a very rich senator, one of the most powerful, richest people in Roman society, you were probably pretty safe. I mean, you had a retinue of slaves who effectively were guards who would protect you wherever you went. If, however, you were an average citizen, a sort of low plebeian, then, well, things could be pretty dangerous. There was no police force. There's very little street lighting. Just wandering about Rome could be pretty dangerous. And it's very hard to get any data, any hard data, but you certainly get the impression that there was quite a lot of casual violence. And certainly if you looked like you were carrying some money or you were rich, then you would probably need to make sure you did not go out at night.
So when it comes to laws and crimes and punishments and all of that, how did those get passed? If people aren't really familiar when it comes to the legal system as a whole, who's making these decisions and passing these and having that trickle down then to the average person?
So there are actually various different ways that laws could come about. So there are some very old traditional laws called the 12 Tables, but then the Senate could pass laws. But then later on, once you have the emperor could make decrees, and they are effectively laws, or they would issue what are called rescripts, so which is where they would write a reply to a petition. So let's say you have a complaint that someone has stolen your cloak or something like that. You could write to a local governor or centurion or even the emperor and say, please help me get my cloak back. And if the emperor, I think he'd be unlikely to answer you about a cloak, but let's say it's a bigger matter. If he replies, then he will give a statement of what is in effect the law.
So would that be like the most common crime then, like theft in ancient Rome? Or is there any way of knowing that?
I think there's one interesting group of evidence we have from this country, actually, from Bath, city of Bath in Britain, where there was a famous bathhouse there, where the city obviously gets its name from. And people, when you go into baths, obviously you have to undress, leave your clothes in the changing room. And that meant they were very commonly stolen. And what people would do is they would then go to a curse tablet writer who would sort of be plying his trade outside the bathhouse, and you'd put a curse on the person who's stolen your cloak or whatever. And there's about 130 odd of these curses that survive. You'd write it on lead, you'd roll it up, you'd throw it into the spring water that feeds the bath as an offering to the gods of the sort of underworld who would inhabit that spring. And you'd hope that they would kind of get this, get your own back on the thief. And of those 130 odd, about a third, about 40 of them are about theft. Now that kind of would suggest, you can imagine that petty theft probably was statistically the most common crime that would affect most people, but it's probably exaggerated in that particular instance because it's at a bathhouse where people weren't able to take as good care of their belongings as they would normally.
So then going back to, I guess, you're talking about how people take these laws into their own hands and how, they're doing these curses or they're trying to write to get attention for things like theft and these crimes. This is the average person doing this. So what is, when it comes to, if we're just going to take theft because we're kind of running with that, what is the way that these would be handled then if you're the criminal? Is there any, repercussion on that side, if at all ever? Is there something written into those laws where it's like, even on the base level, we know what the punishment would have been for things like that?
The problem with a lot of Roman law is that it's called civil law. So it's not criminal law, which is when the state prosecutes someone for doing something which they think is so dreadful that the state needs to act on behalf of the community. With civil law, it's just one individual suing another for damage that they have done to them. So the problem with that, of course, is you need to have somebody to sue. You need to know who's stolen your cloak. Now, if I know that you've stolen my cloak, I can go to law or petition perhaps the governor, or even go to a magistrate and put a charge against you. But because it's also civil law, all the law would do would recompense me for the loss of the cloak and perhaps some sort of hassle factor. And it's normally set at about 4 times the value of the theft. If there was some kind of aggravating factor like violence, that you'd pummeled me over the head while you were stealing the cloak, then you might actually look to get a centurion or something to actually then issue further penalties against you. But there's no police force, there's no communal criminal law that is actively involved in hunting out small-scale thieves or robbers. So it was just a kind of everyday inconvenience, really, that meant you really had to take good care of your possessions.
So there's a really specific kind of theft as well that you do mention in the book, but I thought was probably worth mentioning as well, that is very specific to the ancient world, which is why I want to bring it up, and that's self-theft. So what does that phrase mean?
Because the Romans had so many slaves, I mean, something like 10 to 15% of the population of the empire are enslaved, which is something like 7 to 10 million people. These were seen as things, as possessions, not as individuals. And so they belonged to their masters. So if a slave ran away, they were in effect stealing themselves from their rightful owner. And the Romans have particularly severe penalties for that, so that runaway slaves could be thrown to the beasts, so fed to hungry lions in the arena. They could be sent to the mines. Depending on what time we're talking, they could just be sent back to their owners, who could do what they wanted with them. They could torture them, execute them. It's a particularly brutal treatment of what we might think of as a natural injustice.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, the last thing on theft, actually, because you just reminded me as you were talking, I don't know why what you said reminded me of this, but you mentioned something in the book about pickpockets when it comes to theft in ancient Rome, and how there was, correct me if I'm wrong, if I've misremembered this, because I didn't make a note of this, but there was like an old Greek custom of people holding coins in their mouths that you said, it's not necessarily, we know 100%, but it's could be that it was carried into Rome. So where does that come from? Because that really, to me, shows how terrified people were of this like base level, what I guess you would call like base level, lowest level of crime.
Yeah, it's one of these funny little things where you just get a couple of throwaway references to sort of poor people having money that smells of coins, having breath, sorry, that poor people have breath that smells of coins. I mean, if you handle coins, it gets very smelly and your hands smell of it. Well, you can imagine if you've got to only have a few coins, where do you put them? Where do you keep it where it's safe? I mean, and perhaps the safest place was just to sort of tuck it in the cheek of your mouth or something. I mean, no one could get at it there. They have some very odd sort of procedures as well for trying to decide whether someone has actually stolen something. They have this particular test of whether a theft is manifest or not manifest, non-manifest. And it's a bit like our being caught red-handed, that if someone steals something from you, and you kind of catch them with the item 5 feet away, then in the Roman eyes, they're obviously guilty. If you kind of only catch them a day later, 5 miles away, well, it's not so clear. They could have come by the money some other way. You might have dropped something and they've picked it up. And so in that case, it was thought to be far less likely that they were obviously guilty. And it was under those circumstances that they could do this very odd thing called a plate and loincloth search, where the victim would be able to walk through the house of the alleged thief, and they would have to hold a plate and wear only a loincloth. I think the idea being that they couldn't plant any evidence, or they couldn't just steal something themselves. And they would sort of walk through the house and check whether they could see what had been stolen. And if their items were there, then they could recover them. But you can imagine how recovery rates for burglary, for example, are pretty modest nowadays. It must have been absolutely infinitesimally small.
It must have been mayhem. And like even hearing all these stories, like, I mean, I remember reading the coin one in the mouth and I thought more people have got to be choking on the coins than actually saving their money. Surely.
I suspect you just get used to it. I mean, I have to admit, I haven't tried it. We should probably go away and have a kind of test or something here and see if you can walk around. It must be very bad for your teeth, I'd have thought. And well, you try it first and let me know how you get on.
I'll send you an email. I'll try it out just at home alone. Don't mind me. But when it comes to just the discussion of crime in ancient Rome, the way that you start off your book, actually in the introduction, which I think is so interesting to look through, especially like what we've discussed now, and then what we will discuss as well about the book, through the eyes of the legend that starts Rome, which is Romulus and Remus. And you open this book by one telling us the story and telling us that there are different versions of the story, but saying it's so interesting to look at that not just as a story, but also as a way of seeing how the Romans viewed themselves. So how does that relate then to the topic of the book, which is the crimes of ancient Rome?
Yes, I mean, it's a foundation myth. I mean, there may be some element of truth in it, but the Romans sort of told themselves this story that they were a collection of outcasts and runaways from other nearby cities who come together under the leadership of Romulus and his brother Remus and decide to form their own community on the site of what is now Rome. But of course, there's this fight between the two brothers. They want to have it on different hills, and eventually Romulus kills Remus. I mean, there are different versions of the story, but it's an extraordinary thing that fratricide, killing your brother, was thought to be one of the most heinous crimes under later Roman law. That if you perpetrated that, you were killed not just by beheading, you were sewn into a sackcloth with a monkey, a cockerel, a viper, and I've forgotten the other one who it is now, a dog or something, and you're thrown into the Tiber, which is a kind of like, it's an aggravated form of execution. And yet they see this as at the heart of their foundation myth. This is the kind of people that they are the descendants of, a fratricide, that Romulus was so sort of focused on founding the new city that he was even prepared to kill his brother. And I think that's what it sort of says in a way. It's that, Romulus is tough, he's a great leader, he can bring together people from all corners of the world under his leadership, but he's also brutal, and that the state comes first. If Rome needs something done, then you have to put every other form of loyalty aside, whether it's your family, your children, whoever it is, then Rome comes first.
Well, picking up off of the idea of leadership and somebody in charge, you have lots of wild stories of the emperors. And actually, you open this book in chapter 1. Your title is Nero's Muggings and Other Violent Crimes, which, what a fantastic first title. Like, so many people are going to read that and just go, what? Tell me more. So you open it, and I don't mean to quote you to you necessarily, but it's just that everybody knows kind of what the feel of the book is. You open by writing, at night, the Emperor Nero used to disguise himself as a slave and go wandering in the streets and the taverns of Rome. This was before the Great Fire of AD 64, which he was accused of starting himself, when the streets of the old city were narrow, twisting, and dark. The Emperor lurked in the shadows until an unsuspecting victim passed by and then leapt out and violently assaulted him. If any resisted, Nero stabbed them and threw their bodies into the sewer. What an amazing start to a book about crime in ancient Rome. So this is wild because this is the emperor of the city that is doing this. Can you tell us, do we know any information about why a young Nero has decided this is a good way to pass the time?
Well, it's bizarre, isn't it? Here we have, he's the emperor. I mean, he is the ultimate source of law, and yet he's prepared to go out and act like a common violent criminal. This is sort of when he's quite young still. He becomes emperor when he's only 16, 17. And to start off with, he's kind of controlled really by a bunch of old men really who sort of are appointed to look after him. And he kind of increasingly gets fed up with this. So it's almost like him being a rebellious teenager, I'm just going to go out and do what I want. But of course, you also have to remember where we get these stories from. We get these stories from historians, the two historians, Suetonius and Tacitus primarily. And they were very much members, not just of the elite, but the kind of super elite. I mean, Tacitus is a high-ranking senator. Suetonius works in the Imperial archive, it seems. So they are absolutely at the core of the court society, if you like. And they are all deeply mistrustful of Nero. And when they look back at Nero, they find that he is the worst kind of emperor that you can have. He doesn't care about the elite. He doesn't care about the Senate. He doesn't care about Rome's traditions. He's just out to enjoy himself and do what he wants. And this is kind of why this is recorded. It's an example of him acting in a way that is unthinkable for a Roman leader to behave, and just being the worst kind of common criminal that there was. So I think these stories, are put in because our historians think that they are particularly revealing of the kind of character that Nero later became when he was a more experienced emperor, when he was, well, allegedly even prepared to burn the city down so that he could build a new grand golden palace for himself, when he would execute dozens of senators just on a whim. So it's has to be taken with a pinch of salt. Did he actually do these things? Maybe, but it's certainly not out of character, if you like, with some of his later actions that we have harder evidence for.
Well, he's not the only emperor that you write about that do some wacky things in this book. Another emperor that you wrote about was Commodus, although no one's on the level of Nero running around at night. But Commodus, you write how he actually would steal from wealthy senators, which that also, if you think of, well, he's the emperor, he's the guy who's in charge, why would he be doing such a thing when he's surely the person that has the most money, the most power, can do whatever he wants? So do we have any idea of, well, obviously kind of the same thing with Nero. Do we know if it's real? Do we know if it's rumor? Do we know how much of this was happening? But also, like, why would somebody in his position want to then steal from other wealthy people?
So Commodus is interesting. So if I'm sure some of you will have seen the film Gladiator, and Commodus is the baddie emperor in that. And he is the son of Marcus Aurelius, who's the last of the good emperors, if you like, who is a philosopher emperor, has very high standards of behavior. And his son is something of a letdown. The evidence that we have for it is actually better in some ways, that whereas Tacitus is writing, say, 50 years after the death of Nero, the stories we have about Commodus are primarily from Dio Cassius, who he was a real blue blood, a senator, the son of a senator. And he writes these histories in the early 3rd century, but he lived through Commodus, so he actually experienced many of these events. And Commodus was just not interested in being a kind of good, diligent emperor. He was, as you said, he's got all this power, all this money. He took the view, well, I'm just going to enjoy myself. And he loved the idea of being a gladiator. And he would just practice being a gladiator and killing animals. I mean, at one point, he's supposed to have killed personally 100 bears in the Colosseum, and would decapitate ostriches with especially sharp arrows. So, he kind of completely, the money goes to his head, the power goes to his head, and he abuses his position. But one interesting problem that the Roman state has is they don't have a kind of any way of raising money when they need it. There's no kind of ancient bond market where they can sort of issue debt. So they tend to just go and grab it off people when they need it. And so what's the easiest way to get a large sum of money? Well, it's to kind of accuse some of these exceptionally wealthy senators of plotting against you or something. Then they've committed treason, you execute them or exile them, and you confiscate all of their possessions. It's quite a neat trick if you're prepared to do it.
So you go into this in the book with this, I mean, not like an idea, but the reality that people were really scared to just be accused of things in ancient Rome, because the accusation was almost worse. Like, who cared if they were guilty or not, because somebody's pointing at them, and so somebody's coming for them. So then what do those steps look like? Like, for somebody who from the outside is looking into this going, okay, well, in the modern day, we have the idea like innocent till proven guilty. And in ancient Rome, that isn't necessarily the case. If somebody like Commodus comes after somebody and says, you're plotting treason against me, what happens? Is it just immediately, oh, okay, there we go, you've committed this crime, done? Or
I think this is where, Roman law in general did actually sort of have a kind of notion that you were innocent until it was proven otherwise. But treason is very different. It's a bit like Henry VIII or something like that. If you're dealing with an exceptionally powerful, sometimes paranoid individual, then questions of truth are neither here nor there. It's whether the emperor believes you or believes the person who has betrayed you. And numbers of the emperors, particularly what are known as the kind of bad emperors, like Domitian, for example, become very reliant on these sort of what are called delatores, these people who would just go around betraying people, listening for information, and then going to the emperor and saying, so and so is plotting against you. And they would be given a cut of the money that was confiscated from the person. Now, you can see how, from the emperor's point of view, that's great. It means that you always find out what's going on and you have a ready supply of cash. But does it generate truth? No. In fact, it encourages people to come up with trumped up accusations because they're making money out of it. And it's always a mark of good emperors that they're much less inclined to listen to this kind of stuff, or indeed encourage people to do it. You can imagine that if you're a wealthy senator, it was always a risk that you faced, always a problem at the back of your mind that you had to be very, very careful who you spoke to and what you said to them, because it could all easily get back to the emperor and it could ruin your family.
Crazy to think about. If you guys want more stories like that, though, I'll link a lot in the description below. Obviously, we won't have time to go into lots of cases about that. And I would like to shift gears slightly when we talk about crimes in ancient Rome, because there's one I thought that was worth discussing, and it's going to get this video demonetized. So if anybody's watching this, just subscribe, because that'll help me, because I want to talk about the subject of rape in ancient Rome, because it's a topic that seems to be at the forefront of so many writers' minds when they're writing about histories and laws, crimes, all of that kind of stuff, but in a different way to how it's discussed, obviously, nowadays. So can you kind of walk us through that a little bit?
Yes, there's a lot of law that is anti-rape. I mean, it's trying to ban rape, but it's very much seen from the sort of male point of view. I mean, this is a patriarchal society. Fathers have power over their children, and for their girls in particular, they are very keen to protect their chastity and their purity as they see it. So they therefore see rape as an act not primarily against the woman, but against the honor of the father. And so in law, if a daughter was raped, the father could prosecute for the damage that was done to him, not to her. It's, I mean, obviously there's a connection between the two, but it's not primarily how they see it. But of course, it also depends where you sit in society. That if you were a slave, for example, well, it seems pretty obvious that sexual abuse was fairly commonplace. I mean, for example, there is a dream interpreter, an ancient dream interpreter. Freud did not invent dream interpretation. And this dream interpreter, Artemidorus, tells a time of how a wealthy man comes to him and he says, I've had this dream where I've had sex with one of my slaves. It doesn't actually say whether it's a male or female slave. And he is worried. Now, we would interpret that. We're all good Freudians. We would just say, well, he obviously fancies his slave. But he interprets it as saying, well, I'm worried that either I will become a slave or, even worse, my children will become slaves, because the offspring of slaves were slaves and belonged to the master. And Artemidorus thinks about this, and his reply says, no, you should relax, because it just means you're going to get some pleasure from your assets. It's a kind of shockingly casual approach to, what we would consider one of the most profound abuses. And yet in the Roman world, if you sat at the bottom of the scale, you have no human rights at all. And it seems highly likely that kind of sexual abuse, rape, was highly common.
It's a really, really fascinating discussion, the idea of rape in the ancient world. And something that really caught my eye in your book was on page 42. In case you guys have it, you can turn to the page. But on page 42, you wrote about these fictional court cases that involve scenarios of rape that pupils would study, but how they seem to be really obscure and not necessarily things that we would actually see going to trial. So can you talk us through those and what they kind of show us about the mindset of the Romans that these things were being studied?
Yeah, so remember that if you are from a wealthy elite family and you are one of the boys, you will be educated in rhetoric, in public speaking, because that is going to be the foundation of your future career, whether it's in the law courts or giving speeches in politics. This is how you are marked out as being a highly successful, educated individual. And so in order to do that, they would practice with made up legal cases that are ridiculously contrived and involve all kinds of odd situations where different laws are kind of contradicted by different actions. And it's surprising how often it involves the act of rape. And it's almost as if there is something peculiar about the elite Roman male psyche, that they see acts of violence against their own household as being sort of how they define their sort of worth as family men. That if you can't protect your women, then you don't deserve to be head of the household. So from their point of view, you know, it was kind of a real duty, and it was a good thing. But of course, you know, the women involved are only kind of there as side players, really, in what is, you know, they're just cut out. They have no meaningful part to play.
Yeah. Well, we've spoken about a number of different sources, like lots of names have kind of popped up in this conversation. And there are a few that you've mentioned that I wanted to kind of touch on because they're really interesting when we think about crime and law. You know, one of them, for example, is the dream interpretation. So can you just kind of unpack that a little bit more? Because I'm sure people stopped when you said that and they were like, wait, how does that play a role in any kind of crime whatsoever?
So the dream interpretation is really interesting in that, I mean, Artemidorus explains that it's all about equivalencies, mental equivalencies. So, and he believes that, you know, the gods are putting these dreams in your heads. And so it's a way of them signaling to you what will happen in the future. Um, and the interpretation of those equivalencies depends on your social status. So, for example, if you dream of leather, for example, if you're rich, then that's fine because that just signals you're going to have a nice cloak or something. But if you're a slave, then it indicates that you're going to be flogged because whips are made from cowhide. So it's a way of trying to sort of think, well, if you dream of such and such an object, well, why does that signal something else? So again, for example, if you dream of a river that's in flood and you know, roaring away, then it's interpreted as meaning that you'll go to court because a judge is like that. You know, a judge is powerful and roars and is terrifying. So you can see how it gives you an insight into their mental world of how they perceive these people, you know, how they understand the business of going to court. And what's notable is that court is, you know, the parallels are with gladiators, it's terrifying, and you can imagine it must have been an absolutely daunting experience for the average person to find themselves in court. I mean, not least because if you're a slave, you had to give evidence under torture. I mean, the Romans believed that a slave could not be trusted to tell the truth. So you had to torture them to make sure that they were telling the truth. Now, we would think the opposite, of course, that they will say, obviously, they will say anything to stop you torturing them. But they have a completely different way of seeing a certain class of humans.
It's so interesting, though, thinking of those parallels, you know, saying that we would think one way, but they thought another way. And when it comes to like dream interpretations, like my mum has like a book of dream interpretation from like the 70s or something that like she just won't part with because she just thinks it's so fun to kind of like dream of a chair or whatever. And she's like, what does that mean? And the book will give you like 8 different options. But those are not the only examples of things that we do now, at least not in courts of law. But there's another book that you mentioned, which is the 5 books on astrology by Dorotheus?
Dorotheus of Sidon, yeah.
Yes. So he writes, and this is page 58, again, if you guys want to go and find it. But he writes about how he could tell from his star chart readings that he could like describe burglars and how they would enter homes and how they would get keys and all of this just based on like when they were born. Can you unpack that for us?
Well, I mean, astrology is it's pretty complicated, but there are books and books of this stuff, and Dorotheus is a difficult source. He only sort of survives via sort of later Arab translation. But we have other astrologers that survive in the original, and they believe that by just looking at the ways the constellations move and the alignment of the planets and the stars at the time that you were born, that those cosmic forces mold you into the individual that you become. And so it will make you be a thief, that you're the kind of person that becomes a housebreaker. And so Dorotheus describes, the kinds of people who will break into your house as having thick eyebrows and sort of curly hair. I mean, it's very specific. And I mean, for us, it's obviously slightly odd. You think, why would people believe this? But it's a world where I think the Romans think that the divine, if you like, inhabits absolutely everything. And the various forms of gods are constantly in communication with you, telling you what you should do, what will happen to you. If only you can work out how to understand it and interpret it. So they're looking for anyone who is able to do that, whether it's someone who says, I can do it by looking at the stars, or by analyzing your dreams. There's a short book on interpretation of moles. So, as in, skin marks. Another sort of short papyrus deals with twitches. So, if your elbow twitches, it means you're going to have sort of trouble with your women folk. And they just sort of, you can imagine, just whenever anything out of the ordinary happens, they think, my God, that is a sign from the gods. What does it mean? And they turn to what they see as experts. And if you went to the average forum, I think you would find all manner of experts. I mean, we would call them charlatans, but trading their expertise to help you understand what the gods were telling you.
Would any of those actually hold up, though? Like, let's say you get charged for something like really big, not treason, not that big, something a little bit lower than that. But like, and then you've got someone come in and say, well, according to the stars, there was no way that they couldn't have done this. Do we have any reports of that actually working? Or is this just like a lower sort of level of interpretation?
It's not going to work in court because they will look for evidence. I mean, there's a famous example from the writer Aulus Gellius, who is a judge at one point, and he's in a case where someone is accused of stealing money, and the person who's making the accusation has got various paperwork, but he just thinks instinctively that the accused person is obviously honest and innocent, and he doesn't know what to do. He says, should I let the person off because I'm sure they're honest, or should I go with the evidence which says they're guilty? And in fact, he just resigns as being a judge to get out of the problem. But it's quite interesting. It does sort of show you that, for all the sort of oddities of Nero and these extreme examples we have, that probably on a day-to-day basis, the Roman courts were trying to deliver what they saw as justice based on evidence. It's just that sometimes they go about it in, particularly cruel ways with the treatment of slaves.
So taking all of this, like the whole conversation into consideration, when it comes to writing your book, I'm always curious about this with historians and especially ancient historians. Was there anything that as you were researching that you came across that either you didn't know prior to writing the book or that you had learnt but you had like forgotten that you thought, oh God, this has to go into the book?
Oh no, I'm always coming across things that surprise me. I mean, not because I've forgotten them. There's a lot of ancient sources, and even if I'm rereading material, you look at it from a different angle, and things leap out at you. So, I mean, I think the evidence that I knew reasonably well but hadn't looked at for a long time is all the Egyptian papyrus evidence. We have. It's a great thing in Egypt that because of the dry conditions there. We've got thousands of documents that survive on papyrus, which was cheap and easily available. And they deal with all kinds of low-level court cases that we just don't get really from the rest of the empire. And I mean, they're fascinating because it's often where an individual is accusing their neighbor or someone from the next street from having broken into the house and stolen things from them. Often accusations of sort of domestic violence, or it's a quite a nasty, aggressive little world. And I think it gives you, I think, quite a clear indication of what it was like just to sort of struggle to survive in this world, how they're often, the curse tablets are one way you can get at your neighbor, but, law is also another way. It's kind of, they're always looking for ways that they can attack each other.
And what was something that you learnt about yourself as a historian through writing this book? Like, was there a struggle that you kind of faced, or was there a translation maybe that you faced, or something that, you left the book going, okay, now I'm a little bit better because I wrote that book?
That's a difficult question. Do I feel a better historian for having written this book? I mean, I'm always interested. I enjoyed writing the chapter on war crimes, partly because it's not something I'd really thought about before, and I think Rome is often seen as being a particularly brutal, militaristic society, and the notion that they kind of had gradations of attitude towards war, I found quite interesting. Um, that it's almost as if they see war brutality and clemency as two sides of the same coin. That if the degree to which you resisted Rome, then they would turn up the brutality. But they're also aware that clemency is a great way of promoting future loyalty. And I think you find that throughout the Roman legal system, really, it's quite a pre-industrial form of justice, really, that you have exemplary, brutal punishments for a few individuals that you catch to terrorize the rest of the population into behaving themselves. But you also combine it with clemency, generosity, because you know that you can't just sort of brutalize everyone all of the time. And I think I hadn't quite sort of twigged really how interconnected those two attitudes were.
So I have two questions left, basically. So one of them, well, which one should I do first? Let's do what's next for you. So you've written this book. We mentioned How to Manage Your Slaves. Before this, you've also written numerous other books. Again, they're all linked in the description below for you guys to find. What is the next project? Can you let us know what the next project you're working on is?
Well, I've actually just finished a project which has just been published, which is on risk in the Roman world, which is it's a sort of slightly more academic work. And that's sort of looking at the ways they deal with future uncertainty, and the various forms of, well, I mean, some of it is, rational, if you like. I mean, sort of how they deal with financial risk, how they deal with maritime risk through maritime loans, but also how they deal with it through religion, things that we wouldn't feel appropriate for dealing with risk. And so I've really quite enjoyed doing that. So I have to admit, I'm having a bit of a holiday. I've got quite a lot of teaching on, and I'm doing a couple of projects. I'm interested in sort of lower class literacy. So I'm involved in a project looking at, well, how involved are, if you like, the artisanal class, so above the peasants, but sort of skilled workers in early literacy, which eventually sort of feeds through into production of the Bible. And the evidence is very difficult, really. But I'm hoping to try and draw that together and make some tentative conclusions anyway.
That sounds so interesting. Oh, I'll definitely be looking out for that. But as the final question, I love to leave my audience, because if they stick this long with the conversation, they deserve to leave with a piece of advice. And if we stick with Infamy and Crimes of Ancient Rome, from your perspective, what do you think is, after reading this book, the next best place that people can go to learn about this topic? It can be a book or, a documentary, TV show, a course, anything like that.
I think if you really want to sort of dig deeper into this, I think the place I would go is back to the original sources. I'd read some Suetonius, the lives of the Caesars. I mean, they're great fun. Or read some Tacitus. He's a bit more difficult, but he's this dark, sort of cynical character. Or even Cassius Dio, who I mentioned about Commodus, for a different angle. And I think it'll give you a real sense for how different a world this was, how their priorities are different, how we're often just seeing the ancient world through the eyes of a few very rich, highly educated men, and just how difficult it is to dig below that to what life was like for the overwhelming majority of people in the empire.
I could not agree more with the suggestion of Suetonius. I love Suetonius. I think he is so fun to read. He's very gossipy, you guys. So I will link my favorite translation of Suetonius in the description below for you guys to access as well. If you guys haven't realized, you can find everything in the description below to make sort of jumping off from this video as easy as possible. Now, thank you, Dr. Toner, for joining me today. And obviously, thank you to all of you guys that continue to enjoy the channel, you continue to engage and hang out in this nerdy corner of the internet. It means the absolute world to me. And so with that, I will love you and leave you. And thank you guys so much again. I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. So I'll see you guys then.